is Jeremy Miller. I'm the CEO of Lionfish Cybersecurity, and today we have Matt Pitchford, our CMO, and Shadi Jahar, our CIO, and along with our special guest, Daryl Diebold, an executive threat advisor at IBM Company. We first met a few years ago through a friend of ours, and I just started talking to Daryl, and he's just got such a deep knowledge of the cybersecurity industry, where we're at, what's going on, that I thought, man, Daryl, I got to get you on and talk with you on camera, because what you've got to share is important for a lot of people. So we're excited to have this chance to have this little fireside chat with Daryl, and so we're going to move on to our first question with Daryl. So, Daryl, cybersecurity in general and how it's come about, what is cybersecurity? We have no framework to go by. Everybody's kind of different on that. What is cybersecurity?
That's a great question. The way I describe cybersecurity to clients, or in general to my 7-year-old Max, is it deals with threats and vulnerabilities. And so whether physical security, digital security, if you think about security in general, it's dealing with what's a threat and where am I vulnerable. And that's what I would say it addresses, or the discipline focuses on. If I was trying to articulate to someone what is the mission of cybersecurity, Simon Sinek likes to focus on fundamentally, what are you doing? The 80-20 rule, Pareto principle. Really, cybersecurity's mission is to improve the time to detection and response for institutions from cyber risks that they're exposed to. So that's what I would say. I'd summarize cybersecurity in that way.
What do you think that the general public thinks of cybersecurity? When they hear that word,
Yeah.
It's like this big nebulous thing.
I think that I don't think that if you think about mass psychology, I don't think the general public, and again, these are all my views, not representative of IBM as a company, but my personal views. I don't think cybersecurity as a formal discipline fits into the psyche of the average person who doesn't live in the space of the discipline. They tend to deal with the consequences, and we tend to disassociate ourselves from immediate risk. So they don't really think of cybersecurity as security. They just think of it as news clips and terms of breaches, if they happen to see it, if it makes mainstream media, right? They don't, or if they experience it personally and they experience some financial impact. But I don't really think they have a place to put it psychologically.
So would you say that from the cybersecurity and security in general issues, some people just don't have a security posture in general. So why would it flow over into this other world that they don't even understand?
Yeah, that's fair. I think that, like, given your background in physical security, people even today from a physical security posture, which would be something that they would consider immediate, they don't seem to be as concerned. And I think that varies obviously by cultural context, where you live in the world, the time that we're living in right now. There's a sense of risk accentuated as people get locked in through the pandemic, and there's some early release happening in different parts of the world. But I would say that they don't tend to think of cybersecurity as an immediate concern. Easiest way to put it.
They're just too busy.
They're just too busy with life. Yeah, I mean, the number of kids I have, and I'm always commenting. My children alone, just by way of example, are always like, "Dad, shut up! I can't believe you're worried about TikTok or Snapchat." I'm like, "You're too young to have it. Why are you even doing this? It's illegal. It's against the terms and conditions." And my kids are just trying to brush me off, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think my kids are unique. I think that's, in general, they don't think about it as risk. They think about it as a medium where they can actually go in and synthesize things and interact with people. They see all of the fun, none of the risk. Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as far as businesses go, and they would tend to have a policy and procedure to go down this path of certain things happen in the business, right. But they never equate that again to the cyber side. Or they haven't been, or do they, or how do you see that?
Yeah,
that part of things?
No, that's fair. So, like, I would say, like, the big issues from a cybersecurity perspective that businesses or institutions or governments face that oftentimes don't trickle down to the individual depending on what they do for a living. The big issues are around understanding, like for instance, their model. Like what is it that they do as a business? What's their core revenue model, for instance? And then where are their dependencies in terms of delivering against that revenue expectation? Making sure their model functions properly. How do they keep the cogs going and the wheels greased? How do they keep that model going? They tend not to think about all of their dependencies underneath. And so they look at immediate controls and concerns. In cybersecurity, the big issues that are facing everyone have really to go back to, I'll probably use a common term everybody's familiar with in the IT world, big data. And when you think about big data, people tend to think about the average person doesn't have a place to put it. So the way I would articulate it is think Google, think Facebook, think about these big meta engines where millions and tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of people are interacting on a daily basis and relating to one another and then synthesizing some digital output. They're putting content out there, whether it's their opinion, reposting, any number of things. They're synthesizing all of this content. Well, if there's risk that's being exposed in all these interactions from a cyber control standpoint, how do you get your arms around that volume? So I would say if you're going to talk about cybersecurity as a whole, the volume of data, the speed, the velocity, using big data terms, the velocity at which the data is growing, largely because of human interaction digitally in the digital landscape, and then the validity, the truthfulness of the data doesn't matter. All of these terms affect sort of this landscape, and so the big issues is fundamentally using a heuristic term, just in common sense for people. Common sense, it's like, if I can't see it, I can't stop it. And so if the space is, that big from a digital landscape, how can I actually see where my risk is coming from?
So how, in that big data, and we generally help more business side than we do personal side, and
Right.
social media is more, except for maybe LinkedIn or something. How can that affect a business even when they're doing their social media type of things? They're giving certain trade secrets away sometimes that they don't realize it, or certain ways they're doing things. I mean, how could that be?
Yeah, so so businesses, they tend to have really good policies, usually from their legal departments or risk control officers or compliance officers around how they leverage social media. I'd say their bigger risks are, if I was just going to talk about going back to the points of what is cybersecurity, threats and vulnerabilities. Threats are really going to be nation state actors, organized groups, whether they're fixed organized groups or they come together by order of convenience and common interest, and then individual attackers that are opportunistic for the most part.
Okay.
Those are really where your threats come from. Vulnerabilities is really where companies struggle as a whole, because if we just took, for instance, the IT function as a service model, we were talking about this before off camera. If you roll the clock back 70 years and you look at how we've leveraged technology, which is just another means of automating outputs, more efficiently taking inputs and getting a better output faster, lower cost, trying to compress the latency out of that while getting the same quality of good output at the end. Technology dependencies may have been 5%. We'll just use that as a number back here 70 years ago.
Dependency on that technology piece.
That's right, their business model dependency,
Yeah.
going back to the business model idea, their business model dependency, these business models have existed for over 100 years. They still exist today, with the exception of some of these meta companies, or not to talk about Meta as a company, but thinking about these .coms and digitally based entities that are out there. If you go back to the majority of businesses that make up all of the institutions and businesses in the world, about 5% 70 years ago, well, have they adjusted from a risk posture standpoint to their dependencies now being 90 to 100%?
Because they've automated everything through technology and whatever they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You're spot on. They've automated so much. And an example, a very simple, basic example would be how we communicate. if you roll the clock back in our own lives, all of us can remember corded phones, I would think, with all the gray that's in the room.
I remember the dial in, the dialer.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Party line. I've got 3 sisters, and I can remember never seeing the phone for days. I would just see a cord that would run from where the phone was docked to the end of the hall in a closed door, or the bathroom in a closed door, or another room in a closed door, or actually watching it move and going down, and then my other sisters, and they're on, and then Party Line came out, and suddenly all 3 of my sisters are on each other's calls, and so obviously I didn't have very many friends because I never used a phone. But just you move from that communication medium, and you fast forward. If we just jump forward and you look at the communication medium now, kids are inundated. Adults, people, are we ever really ever off? We're always anticipating somebody trying to communicate with us. So then how are we ever really processing everything? I would just say that businesses as a function, they've adopted all of these methods of automation, but their models have not adjusted from a risk posture standpoint to these dependencies. Businesses are not unique in this way. Everyone, institutions, governments, agencies, sub-agencies, all of them have adopted these things, but have not evaluated them. So if, like we were talking about before, if you were building a neighborhood, and the neighborhood, was built with all of these bricks, these houses that were housing all of them were built with these bricks, and 95%, 90 to 100% of those bricks had vulnerabilities that you weren't aware of, right?
Yeah, we have a hole in it that the air could get through or whatever.
Yeah. So because we don't have a physical place to relate that to in our daily lives, it hasn't really impacted us.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
We don't have the psychological awareness being driven in us to that risk, right? Business models are no different. They're made up of people.
Yeah, and your analogy with the bricks is awesome, because I think I'm on my computer right now. How many different ways I'm trying to communicate, or this thing's talking to some other server, all these spots they're vulnerable, right? Every one of them. Heck, WhatsApp, Skype, all of these things, whatever they are, yeah.
Yeah, so those are all feedback loops. So all technology does is it's a tool, a means of trying to automate the known aspects of a feedback loop. And that could be a feedback loop that is physical labor, and you apply some machine automation. It could be service industry, you apply some automation to taking orders. It could be in IT itself as a service model and applying automation to repurpose resources, virtualization. And so you see this principle applied over and over again. But evaluating those feedback loops for exposed risk. We try to create these dynamic models for utilization, but we don't, there hasn't been this tendency over the last 70 years. There's a great analogy I use for, I think it applies to everyone that drives or has a vehicle or has seen a vehicle, is that if you look at the automotive industry as a whole, when they have a failure in the industry, a part, not just obsolescence or loss, if there's a component failure that's discovered after hundreds of thousands or millions of vehicles have been put out into the market and then acquired and used, what do?
A recall.
They run a recall. Yeah. And if you just go and you meta search recalls and you look at the number of recalls that have been applied to the automotive industry, they're patching a vulnerability that has a literal consequence where they have liability. You don't see that same trend, so what it tells you is there's not a psychological connection from all of this adoption of automation to how it affects our real lives. But then you see on the news, there's $1 billion of Bitcoin stolen, or actual, the bank transfer system has been hacked by a group in Singapore, and they've stolen, $100 million or $60 million. You see all of these, the SWIFT system. You look at these people at a local level, you and me here, us here. We don't naturally. Well, we may, but most people don't naturally think about how is this going to impact me. Mm-hmm. We don't run to pull up our phone and check our bank account to see, did they get some of my money, right? Or did they take something from me? It's not very personalized.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I bring this back to my previous life in the military, right? You know, people don't care about what's really happening outside of their zip code most of the time.
That's right.
You know, and they're just numbers, right? This
Backyard,
happened.
yeah, the backyard.
Yeah, the backyards, all that stuff, and I can see why that rolls over into cybersecurity even further, complicating the thing because you can't see anything at all,
Yeah.
even if it was here.
Yeah,
Right? Because it is here.
that's right.
Yeah. So, well, that's interesting. So, well, we're going to take a small break then,
Yeah,
and we'll come right back and we'll go into the next section.
great.
Okay, so we're back, and we're going to talk about the historical background a little bit deeper. You kind of touched it in on the last when we were together just a minute ago. But how would you describe, you know, where we started and how we got here in a little bit more detail? Maybe
Yeah.
you're very good at bringing this down to a level that we can all understand and
Yeah.
digest. So kind of go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the historical background, if you go back to, you know, even using physical cards for static inputs, you go all the way back to Turing if you want to, but the idea of automating intelligent actions, repetitive intelligent actions, and then you fast forward and then the adoption of technologies individually to automate those into these institutional business models. This stuff goes, you know, this is World War II, pre-World War II. And so if you think about, if it goes all the way back to then, what seems to elevate risk in terms of how we cognitively think about risk in these models, you know, there's been a large push, and I think I'll focus on academic institutions because academic institutions do a lot of great work around trying to model out historical implications of decisions. And then, but what we all do poorly is projecting forward. It's because history really repeats itself, literally, not figuratively, in terms of the outputs and consequences. Did we really learn our lesson from how we've applied synthesized tools and everything to create better outputs? Did we learn our lesson around how we've adopted risk? And if you look from a technology standpoint, the difference here is this is not a physical space. So there's not something you can see, put your hands on, touch and hold, and it breaks in your hand. It's a digital space, and there are so many mediums within the digital space that it's hard for you to get your head around everything, right? So from a historical background, I would say roll the clock back, go 70 years, and then from a cyber risk perspective, was cyber risk a concern 7 years ago, in general? No, didn't exist as a So,
I mean, I remember I learned cryptology early on before.
right,
Before all this
physical
happened.
security, physical security.
Right, physical security, but cryptology and communications piece.
That's right.
That led into what now happens with all the packets and all that. But you know, it was a concern for certain people,
Right.
like our people in our industry, but not most people.
Which
even back then.
Cryptography is a great place. So my grandfather, Douglas Diebold, was in the Army and did cryptography. And if you look at physical security, cryptography is a way of a discipline in the special forces, in the military as its use. Just using that standard that's decades old, do companies apply that same thinking of risk to their models? No, they don't. And so from a posture control standpoint, they don't really understand their posture and controls. Well, why is that? Well, historically, then there had to be something that pushed, that had, from a priority standpoint, presented a greater opportunity that masked all of this risk, right? What was the great opportunity? Consumerization of IT. And you guys can talk to that. Consumerization of IT, for instance, if you look at smart devices, right? Is smart devices, you guys remember Bring Your Own BYOD.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so BYOD, when it first came out, what was the sentiment? Businesses didn't want to accept the cost, right?
So just so for the viewers, some people may not know what that means.
Bring your own device.
Yeah,
That's
just
good. I
so-
appreciate that. Acronyms can isolate people. So BYOD, you remember acronym, BYOD, bring your own device, as these devices didn't exist 60 years ago. And so if you fast forward to now, have they understood and evaluated risk as it's associated with behaviors and the supporting technologies?
All the IoT items that are everywhere now.
MDM didn't used to stand for, going back to acronyms, mobile device management. It used to stand for master data management. And it was applied primarily to supply chain itemization. So you look at this, so going back to our discussion off camera about academic institutions, they historically have done a really great job of bringing that risk to the forefront and like exposing it through studies.
So Shadi is a professor as well.
Yes, I give courses in multiple universities abroad. Do you think universities and colleges now are doing fine in terms of cybersecurity awareness for new students who will be later on in the market?
That's an excellent question, and I will try to give a politically correct response. And I think academic institutions, so if you think of business models, and I know we're not whiteboarding in this session, but we can in future sessions. But if you think about a business model, and then the supporting IT functional model below it that acts as a service entity, and then cybersecurity, IT as a function makes up about 3 to 5% of every business model's gross income, with the exception of institutions like government and government agencies.
Or somebody that's their whole function is IT.
That's right.
So it's more of
A business model. That's right.
Yeah, okay.
That's right. Yeah, you're right. You're spot on.
Well, I just want to make sure I'm clear.
No, that's an excellent distinction. Is that there are .coms or companies that have come into inception since the web presented itself, and those have different models. But even in them, to use a historical analysis background, the Yahoo breach. But let's stick on the academic institutions. Academic institutions are doing. They're basically training engineers.
Yes.
And so when you think about cyber risk and controls, do they fundamentally understand the problem that they're solving? And if you asked 100 cybersecurity educators or program leaders, what is fundamentally the problem they're solving, they might give you an expansive answer. So, do they really understand fundamentally what the problem is? I'm not going to say they don't. I would say that they're wrestling with the symptoms, is what my assessment would be. Because there are so many of the symptoms, going back to, and there's this disparity between where the money gets generated at these business model levels, the IT function as a service model that only makes up 3 to 5% from a funding standpoint of the gross revenue in this business engine or this institutional model. And then cybersecurity makes up 3 to 5% of this 3 to 5%.
And people are asking them to spend a bunch more money to support that, and it doesn't make sense to the business.
To them, because they're disconnected from their dependencies in
Yeah.
terms of how they rationally think about their model and how they generate revenue. And it goes back to our original point about 70 years ago, less than 5% of automation was delivered through technology, and now more than 95% of automation is delivered through technology.
So 5%, 3%, and then 3% of that back then, and now it's much
It may have made sense back here 7 years ago, but today it makes no sense. And in academic institutions, if you look at how academic institutions of higher learning have done these funded research papers on risk and risk assessment, IT as a function inside of these models makes up very little of their assessment of risk against these business models, right?
They've been using these same reports and these same studies for this whole time, or do they?
You were in the Army, buddy. You remember tactics 20 years ago.
Oh yeah, same book. Yeah,
Yes.
you might get to refresh a little bit.
Why? Wars often get lost because they don't look at the asymmetrical components. But you lived in the asymmetrical world, so it's a little different. But if you look at conventional models have not adapted in the 70-year span at the same rate at which adoption of risk through institutionalizing technologies has happened.
It sounds to me like, and if I could use another analogy, it sounds to me like it's the same thing that happens with every industry. We used to have 8-track tapes, right? The simple one, right?
Yeah.
We went to CDs, and then people that did not adapt, they got squished, and that's what's happening.
Blu-ray versus DVD, right?
Right.
Everybody thought it was going to be Blu-ray.
And if you don't make these adaptions quickly, especially in today's world, you're going to get squished.
That's right.
And we're finding this in these businesses now, they're getting squished.
Yeah, the steel industry is a great way I like to use as an analogy because it's static and fixed, but it affects everything we do. Components in your house, your car, appliances, your devices, the phone you hold. So much of it is impacted by that industry, and it's a raw resource industry. The steel industry as a whole 15 years ago, didn't view cyber risk as a problem. Well, then they found out a decade later that their whole industry was being disintermediated by nation-state actors who were getting unit price costs, and then they were in that industry as well, but they're subsidizing their institutions. Whereas our steel industry is in a free market. And so they were subsidizing their institutions, disintermediating the data, pulling the unit costs through hacks, getting back over here and then doing what? In the market, cutting the price of their unit costs and doing what? Stealing business. Why? Because they could subsidize the losses.
There's all kinds of reasons for cybersecurity. It's not just to take money. It's not, so that's a good end.
Fundamentally, it's data.
Yeah.
How do I take meaningful data that matters to me to disintermediate the model, the revenue gen model, service delivery model, if it's a government institution, the model that this institution has applied itself to and the outcome they're trying to achieve. I don't care about stopping what they're doing because I don't have to stop them from doing what they're doing because they actually give me meaningful outputs in these intersection points where data is created, where all the data value is created, where a user's accessing a service that lives on an asset. I steal that.
Yeah.
And now what can I do? I can disintermediate what they're doing in the market.
And so a friend of mine, Ron Gula, the Gulas have termed this thing called data care, right? That is what they think that the new cybersecurity really is all about data care and treating it more of like the healthcare system did.
Right.
Instead of being, everybody thinking, well, I'm going to go in healthcare, I got to be a doctor. No, there's like 1,000 different places you can go in that industry that still helps the healthcare industry of the people and the institutions and everybody. So
that's an excellent, I don't even think you planned the segue, but this is a great way to talk about the models when you look at the historical background of IT as a function and security within it at 3 to 5% and then the subsequent 3 to 5%. These business models exist inside of these basically industry value chains, right? And there's codependencies in these industry value chains primarily from a proximity standpoint between the units that live, the models that exist in it, and then subsequently to the models that support it intermittently or progressively. And the healthcare is a great, since you use that. Healthcare, you have payer, provider, supplier. So each of those models, right, has a revenue generation schema that they've applied. They have IT dependencies that support them differently. And then have they evaluated the risk and the controls? No. Because, and this is in their defense, they've been so largely focused, and we only have so much attention. The average,
it's a goldfish.
Insert the joke. You stole my line. It's
my joke. I think mine is less than the goldfish. So
we are. We're all the average.
I'm
attention
way
span,
less than the goldfish.
the average attention span of a goldfish 9 seconds. The average attention span of a human being is 8 seconds. Yeah. And so, be patient with your children would be the life lesson there. But even more patient.
Be a goldfish.
Yeah, or be a goldfish. Become a goldfish. But the average person can't. We don't have. I like to tell people or clients. The acronym I use is CI&O. When you operated the OODA loop, CI&O. Where do you have immediate control? Where do you have influence? And then what do you observe? And where you have control is really simple to define. It's where do I have authority, and what am I being held responsible for? If these things are not equivalent or authority is not greater, whenever there's an imbalance in this, you lose control, and it results in frustration, right? Or lost resources. If I have more authority than I have responsibility, I'll misuse that authority. If I have less authority than I have responsibility, I'll become frustrated because I can't achieve the outcomes.
Can't do it, yeah.
Right. And then what do I influence? You see in these business models, they call it politics, but what can I influence, right? What can I influence to achieve the amount of authority I need or reduce the amount of responsibility or get more responsibility, just moving and shaking, so to speak. And then what do I observe? What's happening outside of that? Yeah. And that's why I articulate that as a sphere of control. But to your point about historically, these models, healthcare value chain as an industry value chain, they don't think about these controls the way, just ratios, talking about the math, bad corporate daycare math. If I have 3 security monitoring analysts and they're monitoring, and their IT function has 30, we'll use small numbers, have 30 IT professionals supporting all the IT service functions, and they have 300 business users in their business model, and the 300 business model users have 30,000 customers, right? Now these 3 people are trying to ratio monitor and protect that whole funnel?
Yeah,
I don't think so.
it doesn't happen.
It doesn't. That's a capacity control problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not Atlas.
So-
This is not Atlas Ever holding the Earth, but it looks like it, right, from a cyber control
Yeah,
standpoint.
that's interesting. So how have you historically gone to these companies and said, hey, this is, I mean, you say that, do
Yeah.
they get it? Did they get it then? Or what does it take besides a ball bat, or is
Yeah.
somebody just taking all their stuff?
Yeah, I think the right response is, I'll be reluctant to tell you individually how any one of them responded. I think if you get them in a room collectively from multiple disciplines in the business users, primarily executive stakeholders, because they drive a lot of the agenda from MBOs and everything down. The IT service delivery executives, because they're really in control of the budget, where the money goes to address demands and problems. And then cybersecurity, I think if you get them in a room, they do respond well. When I whiteboard out some of these things, they can see it, and sort of, it gives them a context where they can step back from their day-to-day bubble, and they can go, wow, this problem is real, and our whole business is built on these service delivery models. And then they go, okay, then the next question obviously is, okay, what do I do about this? It's like, all of these symptomatic areas create confusion. And I call it coordination chaos, because you have all of these people that really want to do their jobs. They want to do them well.
Yeah.
And they want to excel and exceed in them. But they need direction, and they're not getting clear direction.
Mainly probably because nobody understands that clear direction to give to them, correct? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, in your day to day, when you were in your previous job, and your day to day, when the proverbial crap hit the fan, or you're jockeying up, working up for a training, it's like you weren't thinking about mortgage, the electric bill.
No, it was,
You were in the moment.
right, that's right.
And these people, in large part, are, we need to be compassionate towards them because they're in the moment. And so the ability to step back from that, it's almost enough just they can get their nose above water and take a deep breath. Especially cybersecurity professionals, because of the ratio I illustrated to you.
So you're talking, you talk about big companies with that particular hierarchy that you described. What about these guys that are small? I mean, most businesses are small, mid-sized. They may not even have a.
And they're suppliers. They're suppliers to other entities.
Yeah, right. They're the supply. That's right. So they're the suppliers. They go down and it messes everybody up. But how do you tell these guys that it's not in their budget? They built their business model and they didn't know about this additional X factor of cost that's going to be hitting them now that they have to do, or their whole business is at risk.
Yeah, that's where I think prioritizing what they need to do from a control standpoint and where the greatest risk is critical for their businesses to grow from that small business supplier to get more market share and grow revenue. And I think, you hit on a really good point, is that companies that are large entities, multinational globals, regionals, tend to think of their risk in the wrong way in some ways, because they're worried about software backdoors, hardware unpatched. You've got 1,000 backdoors, guess what they are? Suppliers. 1,000 of them. And are you going to push your revenue model down so that you can secure them? Probably not. It's not. Yeah, it's from a cost constraint standpoint. You can't keep generating margins that way.
Wow.
So, but you're going to hold them accountable. Remember what I said earlier about responsibility, accountability, right?
Yeah.
And authority. It's like, do they have the authority, the means to do what they're being held responsible for? Now you're pushing the responsibility down to them to do what? Address risks, but their business model, their revenue gen model, didn't take that into account. Where do they get the money for this? So their tendency is, as we were talking off camera, remember what you were saying about box checking?
Right.
And like, you want to articulate that, that'd be great. Just how companies tend to do what? They just
Prioritize.
Yeah.
Do what's easiest. Check off the box. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll do this first, and then the most complicated thing on the list really never even gets addressed.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so they're dealing with symptoms because it draws the most attention, and there's inherent bias, which we won't get into here, but the bias drives them to address and check the box that's most familiar to them to check. And it doesn't affect their cost or revenue model. And so there's this question of, like you're saying, how do you prioritize? Well, I'll give you, going back to big companies, Yahoo's breach that persisted, as they discovered after the fact, for many years, impacted, maybe 1 out of 5, 1 out of 7 people in the world, living people in the world, because of how pervasive, the dependency on Yahoo's technologies were and just the amount of interaction that's happening. If that had happened, it were a physical event, and 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 7 people were affected, that'd be greater than the pandemic, than any plague in history of man, right?
That's pretty
But
big.
we don't psychologically have a place to put this, so that's to give you, to wrap up the historical background. I would say we have to be able to bring this down to earth and localize it, backyard it, make it particular to the people we're talking to.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break right now, and we'll
Yeah.
come back in just a few minutes.
Great.
Thank you. All right, back to the present, here and now. What can we do, and where do we start? I mean, it's a huge problem. Where do we start?
Yeah, I would say, where do we start? What is fundamentally the problem? As we were talking about, what fundamentally is the problem is human behavior. It drives the demand for all of the automation, and it drives through interaction all these synthetic feedback loops. So these feedback loops are really, we have an input, synthesis, and an output, and these feedback loops, the here and now. How do we address the human behavior problem? We're not. We have to sort of come to terms with the fact that we can't unengineer. We can start to remediate some of the impact, and you see that where people do awareness programs. But an awareness program in the life of a company, there's 86,400 seconds in a day. An awareness program, oftentimes from a cyber risk control standpoint, you can have a continuous sort of progressive one, but it's going to make up less than 1% of all of that person's time spent reinforcing other behaviors.
But that kind of sounds like there's no hope, but there's got to be hope.
Sometimes there's not.
Well,
Sometimes there's not. That's a good point. Sometimes I think using illusory terms like storytelling from children's books and thinking that there's a fairy tale ending in some of these categories, like the cause of the problem, there isn't a fairy tale ending. There literally is all you can do to just manage the problem at some point of intersection where you can start to get control around it and reduce the risk. So from a human behavior standpoint, we're not going to turn back that clock. It's that ship's left the port, train's left the station. It's too far. There is no situation, and I know people tendency, and we're not going to dive into this, want to talk about automation, AI, MISM, and all these other categories of things where automation is applied. I'm going to tell you that's going to create more incongruity. It's not going to make this problem go away from a human behavior standpoint. Because in our pursuit of convenience, we've created this cyber controls problem. So if you go step over and go, that's users. And then another category, services. So from a services standpoint, the here and now, just talking the here and now. That's the here and now, fundamentally. Human behavior, we're not going to shut Pandora's box. From a services standpoint, services meaning anything that you go into to then consume or create content. And it's not a physical device. I'm talking about if I pick up my phone, does this phone matter to me? No. It doesn't matter. What matters is what's on it.
Content.
That's right. The content. The content, and then where I go to get it and create more. Interact or access the content and create more content. Or interact and access people, which is doing what? I'm creating more content. So what is that? Those are services that exist on the asset, the device. So from a services standpoint, we seem to realize that their users, fundamentally, we're not going to turn back human behavior. We also realize that assets have vulnerabilities, physical, ICS, firmware, PLC, programmable logic. We could talk all day and multiple episodes about this from a podcast standpoint. We can talk about all of this, these IoTs you were talking about earlier. They've got this, they're aware of it, they're doing things. But the area that nobody's done anything really meaningful in is these services. And the area where all of the interaction happens, the feedback loop, fundamentally the synthesis occurs where all value is created or content, is in these services. And so where should we start? Users, services, and assets. Unintentional acronym USA. I did not mean that. I'm a proud citizen of the United States of America. But I was born in South Korea. But I love my country, the United States. But I did not make up this acronym for that purpose. But services is really where we get all of our value and create all the value. Well, if you look at software development, and again, I'm not going to be exhaustive. I'm just saying, if you look at software development as an area, or cyber controls, or SAST, the static code testing, dynamic code testing, integrated testing, obfuscation, where do we tend to do things, or encryption? The software itself, the service that it provides, we don't look at static code testing comprehensively at all. And I'm not going to name big companies, but I'll tell you, if you look at releases from big companies around patching, around their software, or if you look at the web itself is made up of Java for the most part. And HTML5, lots of Java. You look at the Java and you look at the Java libraries, the vulnerabilities that exist in the number of Javas. Yeah, it's not secure. It's like going back to our building analogy from our first segment. It's like that 5%, all the way out here to dependencies, where it's 95% plus in these services, in IT services delivery. The software services that makes up all of these service delivery models, where all of the synthesis happens and value creation occurs, isn't secure. Mm-hmm. The building itself, the material it was built with, is the vulnerability. It's in fear of collapse, right? But it doesn't take much for it to collapse. And so the here and now, where do we start? That's fundamentally the problem that we can get our hands around. We're already spending tons of money from an IT control standpoint around assets. We're spending money on user awareness, but it's not going to deprovision users. We're not going to suddenly deprovision users because they came to work with an inclination. So from a services standpoint, what can we do? We are not going to remediate all the vulnerabilities in software. It's just not going to happen. But there is hope.
Thank God.
Yeah, that's.
Jeez, I was about ready to pack it up and go home.
Yeah, drop the mic off camera. First and last podcast episode.
Right.
It's like, where is the hope? The hope is really in monitoring. Is that you can't stop what you can't see. It goes back to what we said first in the fundamental principles. If you can't see it, you can't stop it.
Yeah.
Right. And so your monitoring strategy, we have lots of money spent in prevention. If you look at from a cyber risk standpoint, 80% of investments over the long period of time. Gartner used to have something called IT key metrics data, and you could look at IT investments by functional areas. And 80% of investments from an IT security control standpoint go in prevention strategies, intrusion prevention, anti-malware, antivirus, anti-that, advanced anti, I'm antied out. And they've antied up everything. We can keep doing this all day.
And the vulnerability is still available.
And the vulnerabilities.
Just monitor it.
Yeah. Let's monitor it. That's the correct approach. Is that, and fundamentally, if you look at it, it's like, here's the easiest way to think about it. It's like, do you think a prevention strategy is working? It's doing its part, but it's not meant to do everything, because you can only prevent what you know exists, right?
Right.
When we talked about the software vulnerabilities, there's too many. You don't know where they all exist. The human dependencies,
we're going to come back to that in a second. I got some things to say on that.
Yeah.
That's from my perspective of that, but I'll let you finish first.
Yeah, no, I think from the standpoint of the problem, we have to focus on monitoring, because prevention is doing its job, but it's not going to fix the things we know exist, but we can't tell what they are, where the exploits are going to come from. Right.
Well, so that's on the service. I'm going to go step just back to the human element, right?
Yeah.
Where you're very, very dim and bleak on that one. I happen to think that is fixable to a certain level.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm not saying
with waterboarding and electricity, it's fixable.
Well, I'm just saying. So I wasn't just saying that.
Yeah.
But one of the things from a SOF, or Special Operations Forces, the first soft truth is humans are the most important. And in this case, they are, because they're the ones that are causing so much issues, right? But there is some ways to get into that, and we have to start. right? We have to start that training earlier in the process so that we're not just now
That's fair.
dealing with where they're at in their head and everything. How does this all fit together? It's just like you're talking about
Yeah.
to all these executives. I had no idea that when I did this, it really affected over here. They just didn't know.
That's fair,
Right.
but and to your point, here's where I see, I agree. If people would do that from a policy standpoint, if it would be institutionalized and made as a part of policy, but my 7-year-old goes to school, and besides his school iPad, the iPad I bought him are the two most important things in his life. If I put a gun in my 7-year-old's hand, and I took his iPad away, and I said, if you shoot me, you can have it back, he doesn't know the consequences, he'd pull that trigger. I love my 7-year-old, he loves me, but he wouldn't be thinking twice about getting back to Naruto Shippuden on Netflix. And so the tools we're giving kids to use, they are not being educated on the risk.
Correct. So to that, you got to start that early.
They're holding something more dangerous than a gun in their hand.
Right. And I'll use an analogy from Afghanistan. Right. We go over there to help. We hope to change something more positive. It's probably a bad example since the way things turned out. However, one of the things that was always discussed was.
I'm not laughing at this situation.
No, I know it's horrible. I still got a lot of friends that have issues there, but
it is horrible.
but the point is that I'd have these discussions with my friends. They're like, no, this is a generational thing. What we're talking about is a generational thing, but you have to start. And you have to start early and often.
Right.
And so the kind of the approach that we're bringing from Lionfish is that human approach too, right? It's
Yeah.
that by, with, and through, and we teach them why they're doing more the why, and this is how it works. Because if you do just do a checkbox, right? It is, I did it, I'm done. Well, no, you're going to make those mistakes again. Somebody else is going to do it. So there's got to be more learning. So I have a more optimistic hope there. But only because I understand where I'm trying to come with it, which is not being done right now. So
that's fair.
From your perspective, is we're in a shit show.
Yeah,
it
that's
ain't happening,
fair.
so we're done. But we gotta start moving there. So anyways, that's
fair. I empathize, and I like that. I like that you're hopeful because that offsets my dismal despair.
You've been in the industry for a long time, over 2 decades, right?
Yeah, and I've been a user or dependent on IT services for my whole life in some form, knowingly and unknowingly. I just think that I appreciate that input. I just think that be cautiously optimistic because remember how many people you see pulled over on the road, and that's just policy with speed limits.
Oh, well,
and that's not changing that behavior.
Well, that's true. That's true. But
and we're clicking a lot more than we're driving.
Yeah. So it's a lot of things in different professions, right? You bring in somebody that's not necessarily been entrenched, getting their head beat in a tree all the time. You start seeing
that's a really good point. That's an excellent
you start
point.
seeing some things and some different avenues that things should go or could go.
That's a right point.
Nobody's saying anything's perfect, right?
Bias.
Yeah. So you do bring a little bit of years of bias to that.
That's right.
However, it's well-founded bias because that's what's been happening.
That's right. And it's been reinforced by outputs, the facts.
Right, the facts are there.
And the market in the world.
So we need to bring a new way of thinking to this.
Yeah.
To this piece.
The symptomatic approach isn't working.
Yeah.
And I agree with you.
Yeah. So
also, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Along those lines, in our industry, cybersecurity really uses a lot of fear tactics and fear mongering to get people to
not fact-based,
to be motivated.
That's right.
What do you think of that? Do you think that's numb to people now, or is it still effective?
That's an excellent question. So the psychological warfare component, or using it as a mechanism for selling, I think there's a place for using provocative comments, but I think it's only professional if you do that and you support it with fact-based intelligence, and there's some meaningful outcome. You have a recommendation. I had a boss at one time who said, I don't mind complaining, and I don't mind if you complain, just to have a suggestion for how to fix the problem. Because if you're complaining but you don't have a suggestion, then you're not really living with the problem. It's not really affecting your life at a real level. It's just, you just don't like it, it's a preference. And I'm not here to make you feel good about preferences. I'm not gonna, if I bring ice cream, don't complain about the fact that it's not the flavor you wanted. And I like this thinking. It's like, so to your point, it's like, I think there's a place for it, but fear mongering, you're right. I think the inference there is that just fear mongering is not useful. It's not meaningful. if you're providing some recommendations, like why does this matter? What does this tell us, right? This provocative language that I'm explaining about the symptom. What it tells us is what we should focus on. It's a symptom, so if we view that as a symptom, we go, okay, what's causing this symptom? I think that's when it can be meaningful. In the same way a doctor diagnoses something, an engineer looks for indicators. We need to be looking at these symptoms, and that's really what I focus on. What I'm good at is not cybersecurity primarily. I have a bend towards problem solving. I see things that look incongruous. They don't look like they belong this way. Something's not right. And what I tend to do, because I'm obsessive, is to chase those symptoms down to their causes and then say, okay, all of these symptoms seem to be leading back to the same place. And when they do, then that tells me. Claude Shannon is he was a contemporary of Turing and several others, but nobody gives him credit. He is the inventor. It isn't a former vice president. It's Shannon was the inventor. He's the father of the internet. He created network engineering from Michigan, right? Brilliant mind. And because he was so obscure, the average person that can't really relate to him. But he was a tinkerer. He wasn't just a guy in an academic lab. He was making stuff, right? He wanted to know that his thoughts were not just thoughts, but he could actually synthesize something that was functional. And now we have the web, the devices you're using that are connected to everything. And I think that if you look at the symptoms, they go back to the same problem. Fundamentally, how do we get our arms around it? And I think it really is a monitoring strategy. I know that, why should you listen to me? Why is what I'm saying is that I would say don't. Go look at the symptoms in the marketplace and ask yourself what we've been doing over the last 70 years and the experts have been telling you, is it working? Right? Is everybody being professionally honest with you about the volume, the risk landscape? Even though it just may be insurmountable and immediately, it maybe seems so big, it's like, I can't fix that, that's not my problem. Are they being realistic about the symptoms and then taking you back to the cause and saying, here's some really good places to start. Start with your monitoring strategy. Why does a monitoring strategy work? Because from a monitoring, detection, and response strategy or prevention, monitoring, prevention, remediation, for instance. Monitoring works because it tells you what investments you made in people, processes, and technologies are working and what's not.
And what is missing?
That's right. It becomes your lens through which you can see gaps and you see unnecessary overlap, right? Inefficiencies. There are some overlaps that are meaningful, or a measure of overlap that's meaningful because it becomes a validation point of control. But there's a lot that's not, right? Bureaucracy. And so, I think use monitoring as a method for revalidating, and creating what you said, for instance, as you need a natural feedback loop to say what's working, what's not, and start to realize your business model needs to be dynamic from how you view IT service delivery. And this push to cloud, and I know we'll talk about this some other time, that could help from a flexibility standpoint, but it also it's going to accentuate a lot of other risks. That's right. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, Daryl, hey, we appreciate you coming on today and sharing your
Yeah.
thoughts, your heart. I do want to get you back on.
Yeah.
That would be awesome to whiteboard. I know that was when I first met you.
Yeah.
Matt and I, you were whiteboard and we were like, what? This guy is freaking on it. So
I appreciate that. I'm not a great artist, but I love drawing.
No, you were a better artist than I was, and we were getting your point. So thanks again for coming. We
I appreciate it.
And,
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, we're looking forward to the next one. And thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.